Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. I am Bryce Howell, and this is my co-host, Caleb Hale.
Hello.
Welcome, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about a few sections in Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. The first section that we are going to be talking about is that the people govern in the U.S. The second is how the corruption and vices of the rulers in a democracy and consequent effect on public morality. And the third topic that we'll talk about is the great danger of the majority and what tempers the tyranny of the majority here in the U.S. Um, yeah, first off, the so sorry, I'm out of practice with this whole thing. Let the people govern. So in the section that talks about that the people govern, de Tocqueville talks about how there's an election of those that make the laws and an election of those that execute the laws, kind of pointing to the fact that in the United States, the democracy is more of a representative democracy, that the people themselves don't make the laws themselves, but appoint those that do. And so, in that way, they kind of have an indirect effect on the laws that are being enacted and practiced in the states, but still in effect nonetheless. And in it, he says, generally those that we generally choose them annually so as to hold them more completely dependent. And again, I think it's important to note that in America, the democracy is representative so that we don't have a direct effect on the laws being made, but because we choose those who make the laws, we can choose those that share our opinions and values and what we consider to be best in America.
So we could have a sort of democratic republic with the democratic principle of voting people in, but the sort of, I guess, republic leadership of the government actually making the laws and running the government.
Exactly, yeah, and the fact that it's that in some cases the elections are annual, that kind of serves as, to use a civics term, as a checks and balance or check and balance uh, of those leaders, so that we can, if not reverse, then to stop any sort of wild, what's the word I'm trying to think of, like running away with the government kind of a thing.
Hmm.
I guess tyranny
Yeah,
would be a succinct way to put
it's
it.
interesting to think what the government would look like if the terms were shorter. Like specifically, I'm thinking of the presidential election. Like if
Mm,
you have a 4-year term, unfortunately, the period for advertising and whatnot previous to a given election is like a year. So the president kind of loses a year of presidency due to
yeah,
all the drama of an election. But it's interesting to think that, um, if they served only 2 years at a time, then they might have uh, less security and that they could get voted out earlier if they fail to meet expectations.
yeah. It's interesting to me how long, especially for the presidency, or I guess really only for the presidency, the time period of campaigning is. Because like with the legislature, legislature and other forms of political office. I don't really hear much of I was going to say politicking, but that's like an antiquated term of like campaigning, even though like both of those or all of those offices do have, in some cases, more frequent or less frequent life cycles, you could say. But yeah, I was thinking of how George Washington, like, because he didn't want the president to be essentially the king, because in during the Revolutionary War, that's what they fought against, the king. He eventually stepped down because he didn't want his entire life or the rest of his life to be spent as the president of the United States, because then it would be a sort of
Would set a bad precedent.
yeah, yeah. And it wasn't until much later, I can't remember who it was, but it wasn't until much later that there was a term limit put on the presidency, because I think there was a couple presidents after him that had either 3 or 4 terms. And so after the last one, they kind of, the U.S. kind of put a cap on that, like saying, I, it's nice to have a good president, but we don't want to make it a thing,
Hmm.
in a
Yeah,
sense.
which that is an interesting thing that it's interesting that we have a term limit, because you would think that if it's a fair election, then someone would only get elected if they're good for the people, if they've earned the public's trust and proven themselves. So it's interesting that like that would be limited,
Mm,
like that maybe uh, even in that way, there was the concern that maybe someone might gain too much political power to, um, you know, be able to keep from office, and that they might be able to stay in and sort of have a an invalid election and become like a technically democratic nation of like, some dictatorship that has an election that they always win, kind of thing.
yeah, yeah, kind of. I, I'm thinking of a couple countries on the planet that have democracy or republic or democracy in their name, or democratic republic in their name, and the yeah, it's really neither of those things. And kind of along those lines of campaigning and selection of officers to rule over the people. De Tocqueville talks about how democracy and aristocracy are similar in some ways, and how corruption is not so much of a risk in an or it is more of a risk in aristocracy than in democracy, because in a democracy or in an aristocracy, he talks about how power is essentially, quote, an auction. Or in other words, that like the richest guy gets the votes or has the most power, because he has the most sway to pay people off. And you could say, and in democratic nations, he says, democratic nations are, quote, or that democratic nations, quote, prove more corruptible by aristocracies, because of that whole the money and power situation, that in a democracy, rulers are less likely to be rich. And I can't remember the exact laws that control how much money a somebody who holds office receives. But I remember when Trump was elected, he only asked to receive $1 per year because he was so well off, you could say, which I think was an interesting play, given that there's a concern over democracies versus aristocracies and how money's power, you could say.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think it's a kind of an interesting quirk, at least in the US, that even though there isn't formally an aristocracy, it costs billions to like run for president, and there are a lot of monetary limitations,
Hmm.
which having non-political limitations to political action has been a concern that has been addressed in things like when segregation was ending and Jim Crow laws were being addressed, and there were non-political limitations that prevented a lot of blacks and African Americans from voting. Those were a concern, and those were rightly addressed. Um, but I guess it's not enough of a concern to try and remove those obstacles from the individual citizen from being a little bit more involved in politics. That, at least in running for president, I'm not particularly aware of the exact experience of different offices and
Hmm.
roles in politics that you could pursue, governor, mayor, council, city member, and all those. I'm sure a lot of them require money, but maybe some of them not nearly as much. But that is definitely an interesting concern to think about.
Yeah, and de Tocqueville kind of points out that because a democracy is inherently less aristocratic in nature, it kind of makes a democracy more susceptible to an influence in aristocratic sort of circles, which I find kind of interesting because, like you were saying, there are non-political limitations on how running for political office is done. Like I can't remember for certain, but I'm pretty sure there are limitations on like how much money you can spend on a campaign, because it does cost money to run advertising and the like. And there's a quote from I didn't write down where this is from, but he says, so while rulers of aristocracies sometimes seek to corrupt, those of democracies are prove it corruptible. The first directly attack the morality of the people, whereas the others exercise an indirect effect, which is even more feared. And I guess that kind of goes nicely into my third topic, which I wanted to discuss, which is the dangers that or one of the greatest dangers to democracy, being the tyranny of the majority, which I think is one of the greatest one of the greatest fears, I guess, that the American population, for example, has. I know I've talked with some people who have talked about how they fear that their vote doesn't matter, and so they might as well not vote, which in my mind is really equivalent because or that if they think if a vote matters, they might as well not vote. Which I find really sad because in the founding documents of the United States of America, there are checks and balances to prevent the majority from being basically just running away with holding all of the laws and or creating and administrating all of the laws and rules that govern the people. And for that reason, one branch of or one section of the government is controlled by population, and the other is a solid just two per state. And so I think that's an important, I guess, aspect to remember and to consider the fact that one one area is population based or based in the majority, and the other is strictly equal, and is more, I guess, cognizant of the desires of the people in some way.
Yeah. Yeah,
Which
well,
I
I mean,
think,
I think that's a great point that you bring up that I mean, the idea of majority rules becomes a con rather than a pro when the majority is corrupt. And so, I
mhm,
mean, a nation based on democratic principles relies on the morality and the wisdom of its citizens to operate. I mean, there's that famous quote. I see how does it go? Like the well, I mean, it basically expresses that same principle. I wish I remembered the quote better, but I mean, that's the danger of a pure democracy. Is I believe it was it Socrates or Aristotle that believe it was Socrates who was condemned to death and ordered to death because people didn't like his political influence. He was influencing the youth,
yeah. Oh,
and
I think I
he was
remember
rightfully,
vaguely what you're
in the
talking
sense
about.
of legally, he was legally sentenced to death, and that was majority rule. And so, I mean, the line between democratic rule and mob rule at the national level is that you have to have some elements besides pure democracy that regulate in like the Constitution formalizes human rights, that they are inalienable, they are for everyone, all human beings have these human rights that you cannot restrict. And that's important to protect the individual and establish a safe republic under democratic principles.
I'd kind of like to, in the beginning of these last few minutes here, kind of talk briefly about a sort of touchy, touchy subject, which is anarchy. And
Mm,
in the book, he talks about how in many cases there's a misunderstanding of tyranny, especially as it relates to democracy. How most people think that a tyranny is a result of the impotence or the powerlessness of a government, but in a democratic state, tyranny is really a
too much
result
power.
of, yeah, yeah, it could be a result of too much power. And when the government receives too much power, the people don't necessarily, or I guess can choose to ignore the government that controls them and I guess rise against them, which we don't recommend because it leads to some pretty terrible things.
Yeah. Well, I
But
mean, political uprisings are always messy, but sometimes they're necessary, as in the case of the Revolutionary War.
exactly, yeah. And in the Constitution, it talks about how it is justified to go up against one's rulers when they're provably and unjustifiably. I can't think of the language off the top of my head. I'll have to include them in the description.
like corrupt or tyrannical.
Yeah. Corruption and tyranny being the two kind of main factors that justify a changing of the Constitution specifically. And in the Federalist Papers, the authors point to justice being the end of the government and the end of civil society, or in other words, what they're trying to seek for. That justice is the end goal, and he said, when a war against the government breaks out, the instinct of some is to point to the impotence, but in reality, it's because democracy is citizen led, the government loses power over the citizens. And Jefferson, de Tocqueville points to Jefferson, who says, the tyranny of the legislature, or the governing body that makes the laws, is the most formidable dread at present, and that of the executive will come in turn. And then to kind of, I guess, point to what we can do within a legal and a moral society, a moral nature to guard ourselves against a tyrannical nature of a government, a a potential of a tyrannical nature of a government, to prevent such things from happening, is, or I guess something inherent in our government, is the absence of administrative centralization. That, and we kind of talked about this earlier, that the majority doesn't pretend to do everything, thankfully, because, like you were saying earlier, Caleb, the difference between, or there is a difference between a mob rule and a democratic state, but thankfully we have checks and balances against such, that it's not just the majority that makes up all of the laws and executes them, because then things like the end of slavery, which was part of what the Civil War was about, uh, wouldn't be, I guess, eradicated, because the I guess the or because the slaves didn't really have much of a voice in the political stage, I guess you could call it. And
Yeah.
sorry, were you saying
Hmm.
something?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the individual personal protection is what makes our country not just majority rules and minority suffers, but the majority consensus helps to guide what ought to be policy. But because of the rule of law and constitution and human rights and the various systems that have been developed to protect the individual, you don't have blatant oppression of minority groups. I mean, life is complex. There's, hardships for everybody, but you can't have legalized oppression and it isn't just a battle of, you know, Republican president, the Democrats suffer. Democratic presidents, Republicans suffer. And it's just a war back and forth.
Hmm.
And that has helped keep our country a lot more civil because it is illegal to be overtly uncivil.
Despotic, yeah, tyrannical and despotic. That's a great word. That's a great word, despotism. It's a terrible thing, but it's a fun word. This is gonna get us. Anyways, and then I guess I had two more things to add before we conclude. And thank you to whoever's sticking around to listen to us. he points to something interesting, or something that I found interesting, that the legal profession is really one of the only aristocratic elements of a democracy. That the law profession serves as kind of a counterbalance to democracy, because it is a paid profession, and in some ways that makes it somewhat susceptible to bribery and to the weaknesses that an aristocratic government has, through bribery or through the use of money to influence a certain ruling, or towards a certain aspired to ruling, but it seeks to kind of provide a sort of counterbalance to a I guess some of the more dangerous elements of democracy. And then the last thing, which I found important, is that a trial by jury is a political institution, and as he says, they're temporarily vested with the right to judge. And I think it's important that such a institution is governed, or is peopled by the people, or is that the office is peopled by the people, because it enables that sort of, again, checks and balances to be more wholly and completely and morally done, because it's the people and not somebody in a paid position to make some willy-nilly ruling just to get a paycheck. And then I guess, do you have any thoughts before I kind of conclude?
Um, I think it's just important that everyone's voice is heard and that everyone is equal in the equal before the law, equal in standing, but that everyone has an obligation to be well informed and not to, view all viewpoints as equally good, but to carefully consider all the options and to consider the responsibility that they have to vote and to make the country the best that they can.
Yeah, thanks. Eh, I guess I would conclude by seconding that it's important to be well educated. And I was talking with a friend, and he mentioned a quote by Jefferson, or by Benjamin Franklin, I think it was, that I'll kind of paraphrase, that he would take somebody who's uneducated over somebody who's well educated in a way that's false. But I guess saying that, I would second what Caleb was saying, that it's important to study the issues at hand, and to be well informed, and to seek out well informed and truth telling sources that tell that tell things how they are, and aren't aristocratic in nature, just telling things or seeking out the ends being a sort of paycheck or political power, because like de Tocqueville was saying, the ends should be for justice. And with that, I'll send you off. And thanks everyone who stuck around to the end. Please leave a comment or any sort of advice on the at the means provided, and we'll see you next time.